Emily Harrison was 34 when she realized she was not only losing her battle with cancer, but also the last shred of dignity in her marriage. In the immaculate halls of Mount Sinai, surrounded by machines that beeped with clinical regularity, Emily spent her days in a room where the New York autumn light barely filtered through the blinds. She had been a vibrant woman, with a promising career in environmental law, married to James for 9 years. He was her rock, her companion, her supposed refuge. But the last few months laid bare a bitter truth. James had withdrawn emotionally. Each visit from him was shorter, more absent, more mechanical. Emily, though fragile, was still lucid enough to notice the silences, the excuses, the eyes that avoided hers. Everything began to fall into place the day Sarah arrived as her new private nurse. Cheerful, overly made up, with a smile that looked more like it belonged in a bar than an oncology unit. Emily noticed how James relaxed when she was around, how they avoided each other's gaze in her presence, but sought each other out as soon as they thought they weren't being watched. It didn't take long for her suspicions to be confirmed. Sarah wasn't a nurse. She wasn't licensed, and everything had been arranged by James. Using funds from their shared account, she had financed a parallel lifestyle of luxury and lies. Emily cried silently that night, not for the cancer, not for the deception, but for the child she had lost weeks before. A secret pregnancy she had hidden to protect herself. That child, who would never see the light of day, became the breaking point. The moment she decided that, even though her body was shutting down, her story would not end in defeat. If this part touched you, subscribe. It's the only way we can keep telling stories like this. Emily wasn't an impulsive woman. Her illness had forced her to live with an almost surgical level of serenity. But James's betrayal awakened her in a way that even the most aggressive treatments hadn't achieved. With the help of Olivia, her younger sister and only confidant, she began planning what would be her final act of justice. She amended her will, cutting James out of any inheritance. Instead, she left every cent to foundations that fought cancer, supported abused women, and offered scholarships to disadvantaged young people. She was meticulous. She transferred assets, sold stocks, closed accounts, and documented everything with a precision that would have made any lawyer weep with pride. She did it without hatred, without shouting, without revenge. She did it with a calm born of the purest pain, that of having loved someone who didn't know how to care for her. The letter was written over several nights, between IV bags and pauses to cough up blood. Every word was thoughtful. She spoke to James not as a victim, but as a witness. She told him she knew about Sarah, about the hotels, the expensive watches, the hidden apartment in Brooklyn. She told him about her lost son, her broken dreams, the time she waited for him with a smile even though she was falling apart inside. But she also told him that she still believed, somewhere deep inside, he could change. Along with the letter, she left him an antique mirror, a piece inherited from her grandmother with an ornate silver frame. Every morning, she wrote, look at yourself, not to judge yourself, but to remember who you were and decide who you will be from this day forward. James received the letter and the mirror 2 days after the funeral, before the earth on Emily's grave had dried. He expected papers, property, perhaps a hidden account. Instead, he found a thick envelope and the mirror wrapped in blue velvet. At first, he thought it was a cruel joke. He reread the letter 3 times, each word falling like a stone in his stomach. He couldn't deny it. It was all true. Emily had seen everything, known everything. She had kept silent, not out of weakness, but out of strategy. Her outrage turned to a mixture of shame and fear. Sarah, upon learning they would receive nothing, disappeared. She took what little cash remained and left James alone, for the first time in years, without lies to sustain his world. In a matter of weeks, everything collapsed. The house was foreclosed, accounts were frozen, friends vanished. Some knew what he'd done, others simply didn't want to be tainted by the scandal. Emily's parents confronted him at a press conference, revealing his double life and the emotional defrauding of their dying daughter. It was the beginning of the end. James, who had once been invited to charity galas and exclusive events, now walked side streets with a backpack slung over his shoulder, his eyes cast down. He got a small studio apartment in Queens thanks to a past acquaintance who offered him a no-questions-asked lease. On the bare white wall, he hung the mirror. Every morning he looked at it, at first with anger, then with sadness, then with something resembling recognition. For the first few months in Queens, James lived like a ghost. He slept poorly, ate little, and avoided any place where he might encounter someone from his past. News of Emily's million-dollar donation circulated in the media for weeks. His name appeared in headlines like the cheating husband or the disinherited widower. He lost job offers, interviews, even minor opportunities. No one wanted to hire the man who betrayed his dying wife. But amid that isolation, something began to change. Emily's letter became not a dead weight, but a guide. Her words, written without hatred, showed him a version of himself that was unbearable, but real. It was the first time James had seen himself unvarnished. He decided to seek help. He joined a community center that offered group therapy for men in crisis. He didn't speak during the first sessions. He just listened. Stories of violence, abandonment, infidelity, but also of rebuilding. One day, without quite knowing why, he shared his own. No one applauded, no one comforted him, they just nodded. It was enough. He began attending regularly. He volunteered at a hospice foundation, one of those that had received Emily's legacy. At first, they regarded him with suspicion, but his attitude was different. He wasn't trying to clear his name, he just wanted to do something useful. He washed dishes, changed sheets, pushed wheelchairs. Each task was a kind of silent penance, but also a way to feel a human again. Are you feeling something reading this? Then don't think twice. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. One day, while helping a patient settle into her room, he found a brochure on the nightstand with Emily's name on it. It was the campaign bearing her name, part of the oncology ward that would soon be inaugurated thanks to his donations. The impact was immediate, not only from seeing her mentioned in a place filled with life and struggle, but because he understood that Emily had thought of everything. Not only had she stripped him of his privileges, but she had forced him to live with his own conscience. And yet, she left him a path, not an absolution, but a possibility. From that day on, James volunteered to work exclusively in that ward, even though he wasn't paid a cent more. He felt that there, he could at least pay off some of his invisible debt. Over time, the rumors died down. The press looked for other tragedies, other infamies. James became a familiar face at the foundation, always discreet, always willing. He learned to listen, to be present, to apologize without saying it. At night, he continued to write in a black notebook where he jotted down thoughts, memories, and broken dreams. He spoke to his unborn son, telling him about the things he had learned late, about how he wished he had been different if he had ever had the chance to be a father. That notebook, worn from use, became his form of private redemption. No one read it, no one knew it existed. But for James, it was like a second letter, one that this time he wrote from a place of love. The official announcement of the opening of the Emily Harrison Oncology Wing arrived with an unexpected invitation. They wanted James to speak at the opening ceremony. At first, he considered turning it down. What could he possibly say after everything he'd done? But it was Olivia who encouraged him. She called him for the first time in almost a year. Her voice was harsh but sincere. Emily chose you for this, not to publicly redeem yourself, but to bear witness to what you'd learned. That sentence disarmed him. He accepted, fearfully. He spent entire nights writing what he would say, and countless others crossing it out. No words seemed enough. No phrase could encompass the damage, the lost love, the truth revealed. On the day of the event, James arrived hours early. He dressed soberly, without expensive suits or luxury watches. He carried only Emily's mirror in his backpack. The room was packed: doctors, patients, donors, journalists. Olivia was in the front row. When he was introduced, he walked onto the stage with his heart pounding in his chest. He took the microphone, took a deep breath, and began. He didn't apologize. He didn't justify his actions. He simply told the story as it was. The betrayal, the discovery, the letter, the mirror. He spoke of the child who was never born, and the man he himself had killed inside himself out of fear, selfishness, and cowardice. Each word resonated like an echo that no one interrupted, no one cried, no one applauded. Everyone simply listened. When he finished, he walked off the stage silently, his hands shaking and his eyes moist. There was no applause. He hadn't expected it. But a young woman, bald from chemotherapy, approached him with a gentle smile. "Thank you for telling the truth," she said, before returning to her family. That was all. It was enough. James left the hospital that afternoon feeling, for the first time in a long time, that he had come full circle. The past wouldn't be erased, but at least he could stop dragging it around like a chain. That night, in his studio in Queens, he placed the mirror on his desk and wrote a single sentence in his notebook. "Today, finally, I saw myself." The following months were different. James began giving small talks in support groups, not as an example, but as a warning. He spoke to young people about emotional responsibility, about the voids one tries to fill with lies, about the cost of betraying someone who truly loved you. He never mentioned Emily by name. He simply said, "she," because he knew that those who needed to hear would understand. Her story became a tool, not a banner. He continued working at the foundation, and when someone asked why he was doing it, he simply replied, "I'm paying off a debt that money can't settle." Sometimes on his way out of the hospital, he would stop by a nearby park and sit and watch the children play. It wasn't masochism. It was a way of imagining what his life would have been like if he hadn't ruined everything. One Saturday afternoon, while he was having coffee in that same park, a girl about 6 years old approached with a flower in her hand. "It's for you," she said, and without waiting for a reply, ran back to her mother. James stared at the flower, surprised by the simplicity of the gesture. He held it carefully, as if it was something sacred. He didn't know why, but he thought of his son, how perhaps in another universe he would have been the one to bring her flowers for no reason. That flower, though small and wilted the next day, remained for days on his desk, next to the mirror. It was another symbol, not of what he had lost, but of what he could still do with what remained of his life. Little by little, his routine became meaningful. He began studying nursing in community courses. He struggled to concentrate, but felt that learning to care was a way to rebuild himself. Olivia visited him occasionally. Sometimes they spoke at length, other times they just shared silence. She hadn't fully forgiven him, but she respected his effort. "Emily would be proud of you," she once told him, without looking at him. He didn't respond. He couldn't. He just lowered his head and pressed his lips together to keep from crying. He knew it would never be enough, but he also knew that every day he decided not to give up. He was honoring the only thing that still mattered to him, the legacy of a woman who, even in death, had guided him back to himself. In one of the hospital's hallways, a new plaque was hung below the main sign of the oncology wing. It read, "This space was made possible through the generosity, vision, and love of Emily Harrison." Every time he walked by, James paused for a few seconds, not to grieve, but to remember. Some of his colleagues already knew his story. Not all regarded him with sympathy, but most respected his presence. He had shown that he wasn't there out of guilt, but out of commitment. Once, a young nurse asked him if it wasn't painful to work where he had lost so much. "Yes," he replied, "but it's also where I have gained the most." His life remained simple. No luxuries, no embellishments. He had an old mattress, a small kitchen, a mirror on the wall, and a nearly full notebook. But every object had a purpose. Every day was part of a slow, honest construction. Sometimes, while washing medical instruments or helping change sheets, he recalled details of his old life. An expensive dinner in Manhattan, a fake laugh, a complicit silence, and he wondered how he had been able to live like that without noticing the damage. These reflections didn't torment him, but they kept him alert. He knew that one false step was enough to fall into the same darkness. That's why he forced himself to remember, because forgetting would be the true failure. One winter evening, while organizing supplies in the palliative care ward, he found a patient crying quietly. Her name was Irene, 39 years old, and diagnosed with terminal illness. She had been abandoned by her partner just a week earlier, having learned that her illness had no cure. James sat down next to her, saying nothing. He just handed her a handkerchief and stayed there. After a while, she asked him if he'd ever felt anything like this. He nodded. He didn't tell his whole story, just part of it. I walked away from someone who loved me when I needed him most, and when I wanted to come back, it was too late. Irene didn't respond, but took his hand. In that simple gesture, James felt that his entire journey had meaning, that his presence there at that moment was worth more than 1,000 apologies. From then on, he began to seek out more moments like that, not because he wanted to be a hero, but because he had understood something fundamental. Accompanying someone in their pain doesn't require perfection, only humanity. He became a constant figure for the loneliest patients, those who didn't receive visitors, those who no longer expected anything. He didn't talk much. He learned that silence, when offered well, can heal more than any words. The doctors began to trust him. The nurses considered him part of the team, even though he didn't have an official title. And James, for the first time in his adult life, felt useful without needing recognition. It was as if, after losing everything, he had finally found something that couldn't be bought or stolen: purpose. One afternoon, when he arrived home, James found a letter in the mailbox with no return address. Upon opening it, he instantly recognized Olivia's handwriting. It wasn't very wordy. "I was at the hospital today. I saw you from a distance. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I needed to tell you that Mom cried when she saw your name on the volunteer list. I didn't expect that. None of us expected that. Thank you for taking care of what she loved." James read the letter several times, his eyes watering. It was the first clear sign that his efforts weren't going unnoticed. It wasn't forgiveness, but something much rarer: genuine recognition of change. That night he didn't write in his notebook. He just sat in front of the mirror, the same one Emily had left for him. He looked at himself carefully, searching for traces of the man he had once been. The wrinkles, the dark circles under his eyes, the more serene expression. He had aged, yes, but he had also changed profoundly. He thought about how Emily, even in her final days, had had the foresight to leave him that object, not to torment him, but to force him to see. Not just to see his reflection, but to face his decisions, the emptiness he had caused, the damage that cannot be repaired but can be transcended. That mirror no longer showed him a monster. It showed him a rebuilt man, imperfect but honest. Months passed, and James's life became filled with small routines that gave him structure. Coffee on the corner before his shift, greeting patients, and the new notebooks he started every 3 weeks. He no longer wrote only for his unborn child. He also spoke to Emily. Sometimes he told her about his day. Other times he simply thanked her. One day, as he wrote, he realized he no longer carried the letter around with him like he used to. He didn't need to reread it every week. He carried it inside, like a compass. That day, he also wrote something different. "I don't want to be remembered for what I did to you, but for what I learned from you." At the foundation, they proposed creating a training program for new volunteers, and James was invited to collaborate. He prepared a talk carefully, without drama. He spoke about presence, empathy, and how eye contact can be more important than any technique. He didn't share his entire story, but a few examples were enough for the audience to understand that he wasn't speaking from a manual, but from experience. His participation was so impactful that he was invited to repeat it at other hospitals. For the first time, they applauded him, and although it stirred something inside him, he accepted it with humility. He knew that the applause wasn't meant to reward his past, but to validate the path he had taken since then. One weekend, during one of those talks, a woman in the audience approached him with an envelope. "This is for you. I don't know if you remember Irene, the patient you saw last year. I'm her sister." James looked at her in surprise. The woman explained that Irene had passed away peacefully and that in her last week she had written several letters, one of them addressed to him. When he got home, James opened it with trembling hands. Irene thanked him for his silence, for his company, for not running away when she felt most alone. "That day, when you held my hand, was the first day in weeks that I didn't feel afraid," the letter said. James cried, not from guilt, but from something new, gratitude. As time passed, he began collecting these stories, not to publish them, but for himself. Each person he had touched, each moment of shared humanity, was recorded in a new notebook, the other's notebook. He didn't speak about himself, but about them. He titled it Testimonies of Dignity, and although he never planned to share it, a nurse accidentally found it and showed it to the hospital director. Soon, the texts reached a medical publisher interested in publishing true stories of palliative care. They offered to include some of them. James accepted, but asked that his name not appear. He simply wanted the patients' voices to be heard, without his personal story stealing the spotlight. It was his way of bringing the focus back to what truly mattered. The publication had an unexpected impact. Healthcare professionals from different states began writing to the foundation, thanking them for the sensitive way in which patients' experiences were described. Some stories were incorporated into training programs at universities. And although James remained anonymous, he felt part of something much larger than his own redemption. Emily had pushed him toward an individual transformation, but he, unknowingly, was sowing a collective transformation. Each shared story was an echo of dignity, a seed that inspired others to look at care through different eyes. One day, the hospital director called him into his office. He was offered a permanent position as a volunteer coordinator. "I know you don't have a degree, but you have what many don't learn in years of study: presence, respect, and a deep awareness of the value of human time." James accepted, not out of ambition, but out of commitment. He knew that taking on this role was one more way to honor Emily, Irene, and so many others. At the ceremony where his appointment was made official, it was Olivia who spoke. "My sister transformed her pain into a legacy, and this man, whom we didn't recognize for years, turned it into a mission." It was the first time James saw her smile sincerely since the funeral, and it was also the first time he felt, deep down, that perhaps he was no longer living in the shadow of his mistake. After assuming his new role, James implemented small but significant reforms. He implemented active listening workshops, proposed the creation of an emotional respite space for volunteers, and designed a protocol to support family members in the aftermath of the death of a loved one. Each initiative was inspired by what he himself had experienced from the other side: loneliness, abandonment, and wordless grief. His approach was not technical, but deeply human. He didn't seek efficiency, but comfort. And in that pursuit, he earned the respect of doctors, directors, and cleaning staff alike. Sometimes, walking through the hospital hallways, he'd find someone crying quietly in a waiting room or staring out a window. Instead of moving on, he'd stop. He'd ask if he could sit, if they needed anything, if they wanted company. Most of the time, they didn't speak, but those pauses, those shared minutes, were an extension of the love he could no longer give Emily or his son. It was his way of keeping alive a flame that cancer hadn't extinguished. And although he never stopped feeling sadness when he remembered what he lost, he learned to live with it the way one lives with a scar, not to hide it, but to remember why it's there. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes, in the Foundation storage room, James found a notebook that wasn't his. It was marked with Emily's name. It was an old diary she had left there years before, when she was a volunteer before falling ill. He held it in his hands with a mixture of reverence and nervousness. He hesitated to open it, but finally did. Between its pages were thoughts, reflections, and letters never sent. He spoke of his dreams, his fears, his desire to leave a mark on the world beyond his death. If one day I'm gone, I hope there's something of mine left behind that won't be erased by time. An idea, an emotion, an act of love that inspires someone else. James read the entire diary that same night. Each word was a mirror more powerful than the silver object she had left him. There he understood that Emily had sensed, long before she fell ill, that her time would be short. But he also understood that her decision to change the will, to leave him only a mirror and a letter, wasn't a punishment. It was an act of faith. She believed he could awaken, that even within the cold, unfaithful and cowardly man he had been, there was something worth saving. And that shook him, not out of guilt, but out of hope. Because if she had seen it, perhaps he could learn to see it too. After reading the diary, James made a decision to share part of that legacy with others. He didn't publish the diary, nor did he show it in its entirety, but he extracted some phrases, thoughts, and reflections that he used in his workshops and talks. Emily's words, projected on a screen or written on whiteboards, began to resonate strongly among volunteers and patients. Love isn't always enough, but choosing to love every day, even when it's not easy, can change a life. Phrases like these became mantras for many, without them knowing exactly who they came from. And James didn't care, because what mattered wasn't the author, but the effect. On his desk, next to the mirror and his notebook, James also began to place a photograph, not of him or Emily, but of a sunrise in the hospital, captured by a nurse one morning. The image showed light streaming through a window in the oncology ward, bathing an empty bed in a soft, warm glow. For him, that photograph represented everything: absence, memory, the beginning of something new. When he felt tired or tempted to give up, he looked at that image. It reminded him that although pain never fades, there is always light if you choose to see it. And that life, even after the most devastating mistake, offers the possibility of starting over. A year after the inauguration of the wing, named after Emily, they organized an anniversary ceremony. This time, James wasn't invited as a speaker, but as part of the team. He gladly accepted. He prepared every detail with the group of volunteers: flowers, chairs, posters with inspirational quotes, and photographs of patients who had been there. When the day arrived, he remained in the background, observing, assisting, smiling. It was Olivia who noticed his absence from the program and decided to improvise. She took the microphone and, without a script, said, "I want to thank someone who never asked for recognition, but who has made this place a haven of humanity. Without him, my sister's legacy would not be what it is today." James didn't know what to say. He received genuine applause, without scandal, without cameras. He felt seen, not as the unfaithful widower in the headlines, but as the man who chose to change. That night, he walked home. The air was cold, but he didn't care. He thought about everything he'd been through these past 2 years: the fall, the loss, the rebuilding. Every step reminded him that he was alive, not because he deserved it, but because he'd chosen not to give up. When he got to his studio, he sat in front of the mirror, took out his notebook, and wrote, "I felt no shame today, only gratitude." It was the first time those words had come out of him effortlessly, and he knew that perhaps he had begun to forgive himself. From that day on, James began to write more freely. He no longer just recorded memories, but also ideas, projects, dreams. One of them was to create a mentoring program for men in crisis, unfaithful, absent, workaholics, emotionally lost, not with the goal of redeeming them, but of holding them accountable. He wanted them to face their reflection, just as he had faced Emily's mirror. He presented the proposal to the hospital director, and although there were initial doubts, the impact of his previous workshops convinced the committee. They gave him the green light for a 3-month pilot project. James called it Looking to Begin. The program began with 5 men, all different, but with similar wounds. James welcomed them without judgment. He asked them only one thing: to bring a mirror every week. Not to talk about vanity, but about truth. They used the object as a conversation starter. What do you see? What don't you want to see? What do you hope to find one day? Some cried, others remained silent, but they all returned. At the end of the program, one of them, a man who had cheated on his wife for years, said to him, "No one ever asked me to face what I was. Thank you for not letting me hide anymore." James hugged him. He didn't respond. He had already learned that at certain moments, silence is also a form of love. The success of the pilot program led to its expansion. Within 6 months, 3 groups were running at different times. James didn't become a therapist, nor did he intend to be. His role was different, that of a witness who had already walked that abyss and returned empty-handed, but with an awakened heart. The stories he heard didn't weaken him. On the contrary, they reminded him why he had chosen that path. Each session was also a reminder of his own journey. Sometimes, listening to another man describe their betrayal, their indifference, or their fear, James felt an uneasy echo within himself. But instead of running away, he stayed. He was no longer afraid to look at what he had been, because now he knew who he was choosing to be. One afternoon, while organizing a session, he received an unexpected visitor. It was Emily's mother. It had been more than 2 years since her daughter's death, and they hadn't seen each other since. James was speechless when he saw her enter the room. She looked at him silently for a few seconds, and then held out a small box. "This is yours. Emily wanted you to have it when she was sure you had understood." Inside the box, wrapped in a linen handkerchief, was a small stone with the word compassion engraved on it. James clutched the stone in his hand, holding back tears. He said nothing. He just nodded, knowing that in that gesture a bridge had been built between the past and the present. After that visit, James placed the stone next to the mirror on his desk. From then on, every time he finished a session or returned from the hospital, he would sit in front of both objects. He would look at his reflection, then pick up the stone and hold it for a few seconds. It was his silent ritual, his way of reminding himself why he did what he did. Some days he felt exhausted, others discouraged. But he always returned to that corner, like someone returning home after a storm, because he understood that transformation wasn't a destination, but a daily practice. And although he had lost many things, he had also gained others he would never have imagined. One morning, upon entering the hospital, he found a group of volunteers gathered at the entrance. A patient much loved by all had passed away, and the atmosphere was heavy with sadness. James didn't say much. He leaned closer, hugged those in need, and then asked for a moment of silence. Afterward, he read an excerpt from Emily's diary, one that spoke about dignity at the end of life. The words resonated deeply. Some wept, others closed their eyes. It was a brief but healing moment. At the end, a volunteer approached him and said, "I don't know who Emily was, but thank you for bringing her to life with your words." James smiled. "Emily was all of these," he replied, pointing to the wing she had made possible with her generosity. As time passed, James's figure within the hospital became almost mythical, not because of his grandeur, but because of his constancy. He was always there. He always returned. Some patients knew him only by sight. Others eagerly awaited him. A woman, on her final bed, asked him to be the one with her in her final hours. "Don't talk to me, just stay," he told her. And James, like so many other times, obeyed. He sat beside her, held her hand, and remained there until her last breath. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just honored that moment with his presence. And when it was over, he walked out onto the hospital terrace and took a deep breath, as if he needed to inhabit his body again after so much silence. It was there, on that terrace, that an idea struck him like a bolt of lightning to create a permanent space within the hospital for meaningful farewells. A place where patients and families could say goodbye with dignity, without rushing, without the noise of machines or the coldness of a common room. He presented the project to the steering committee, and although they were initially hesitant due to a lack of funding, several donors, upon hearing of the proposal, offered to fund it. When asked what he would call it, James didn't hesitate. Emily's Refuge. No one objected. Everyone understood that the name carried a story that deserved to continue, not in the past, but as a living part of the present. The opening of Emily's Refuge was intimate, without cameras or grandiloquent speeches, just patients, family members, volunteers, and medical staff. The space, decorated with warm lighting, soft cushions, and Emily's handwritten quotes on the walls, invited contemplation. It wasn't a place of sadness, but of closure. James, seeing a family silently embraced while the soft notes of a piano played in the background, felt something within him find peace. For the first time, he didn't think about what he had lost, but about what he had helped build. And that feeling, unadorned, was his greatest reward. In the following months, the shelter became an essential part of the hospital. More and more people used it, not only to say goodbye to a loved one, but also to reconcile with themselves. Some entered in solitude and left with a more serene look. Others simply spent hours reading the phrases on the walls. One of the most quoted was, "Death is not the end if love has left roots." James noticed how those words began to be repeated in other wings, in other corners. Emily was no longer just in his memory. She was on the walls, in the notebooks, in the gestures of hundreds of people who had never met her, but who had been touched by her legacy. One day, during a routine inspection, a state health supervisor stopped by one of Emily's quotes and asked who she was. A nurse briefly told her the story. At the end of the tour, the woman asked to speak with James. She told him she knew hundreds of facilities, but she had never felt so much humanity concentrated in one place. "You transform pain into structure," he told her, "and that's what changes lives." She asked for permission to replicate Emily's Refuge model in other public hospitals. James accepted, moved. He never imagined that mirror, would take him so far. When he left the hospital that afternoon, James walked aimlessly through the streets of New York. The city was still the same, chaotic, indifferent, noisy, but he was no longer the same man who had lived in penthouses or lied to sustain a double life. Now, he was someone who knew how to listen, who could look people in the eye without looking down, who had learned that redemption doesn't come as a gift, but as a consequence of constant effort. Crossing a park. He sat on a bench and watched a father playing with his daughter. He didn't feel envy. He felt tenderness. Because he understood that, although he hadn't had the opportunity to raise his own child, perhaps he had sown something equally valuable in the lives he touched. Sometime later, a publishing house proposed that he write a book about his experience. Not about his past as an unfaithful husband, but about his human journey in accompanying the end of life. James hesitated. He didn't consider himself a writer, nor did he want to turn his story into a spectacle. But then he thought of Emily, of her notebooks, of her quotes hanging on the hospital walls. He realized that if he did it honestly, without seeking fame or absolution, it could be useful. He accepted on one condition: the title would be The Mirror and the Stone. The publisher agreed. For months, he wrote every night after work, recovering fragments of his life, confessions, lessons learned, and transformative encounters. When the book came out, it wasn't a bestseller, but it did find a loyal audience: healthcare professionals, caregivers, terminally ill patients, grieving family members. Many sent letters to the foundation thanking them for their kind words, their approach, their sincerity. James didn't answer everyone, but he read them with devotion. Each letter was a reminder that he had chosen well. One in particular moved him deeply. It was from a young man who, after reading his book, decided to reconcile with his father before he died. "Thank you for teaching me that it's never too late if you do it from the heart," the message read. James kept that letter in his notebook, right next to the sentence he had written the day it all began. "Today, finally, I saw myself." As the years passed, James gradually stepped back from some operational responsibilities at the foundation. Not because he lost interest, but because he understood that leadership needed to be renewed. He devoted himself more to training, writing, and supporting particularly delicate cases. He no longer needed to be everywhere. His presence had become more subtle, almost symbolic. Many new volunteers knew him for his writing rather than his story, and he liked that. He felt that his mistake was no longer his calling card, but his starting point. He didn't want them to admire him. He wanted them to understand that change is possible, but that it requires sacrifice and truth. One day, while going through the foundation's old files, he found a letter Emily had written and never sent. It was addressed to him, dated weeks before her death. It spoke of things he was already familiar with: betrayal, pain, disappointment. But it also said something new. "I don't know if you can ever undo what you did, but I do believe you have the capacity to try. And that, though it may not sound like much, is more than most people do." James closed his eyes and held the letter to his chest. It wasn't absolution, but it was a final sign of trust. And that, more than anything else, reaffirmed his commitment to the life he had chosen to build. After reading that letter, James wrote again in his black notebook. This time, it wasn't a reflection or a memory, but a promise. "As long as I have breath, I'll keep trying." That phrase remained alone on the page, as if it didn't need any company. In the following days, he revisited old contacts with other foundations, proposed cooperation agreements, and even agreed to participate in a documentary about end-of-life care. He didn't talk about his past. He only shared real stories, faces, and silences. When the documentary premiered, many people commented on the same thing, that there was something in that man's eyes that conveyed peace. No one knew why, but he did, because he had made peace with his reflection. Years later, during a tribute to veteran volunteers, James received a commemorative plaque. He didn't want to give a speech. He simply walked up to the stage, took the microphone and said, "I didn't come to teach anything. I came to learn from those who suffer with dignity." The room fell silent. It was one of those moments where the weight of words outweighs any praise. As he stepped off, a young volunteer approached him and asked if she could take a photo with him. James smiled, accepted, and then asked her name. "Emily," she replied. He didn't say anything else. He just closed his eyes for a second. It was as if life, from time to time, gave him little winks to remind him that he was on the right path. From that day on, James began to notice those little winks more frequently. A patient repeating a phrase from Emily's diary without knowing its origin, a child leaving a flower at the shelter without being asked, a song playing on the radio just when he most needed comfort. They weren't miracles. They were invisible threads that connected him to something bigger, to that silent web of love Emily had woven. And that gave him the strength to continue, even on days when his body no longer responded with the same energy. Because now he understood that legacy isn't measured in applause or plaques, but in footprints others walk on without knowing who left them. One particularly harsh winter, James fell ill. Nothing serious, but enough to force him to rest for weeks. It was Olivia who cared for him. She brought him soup, helped him with his medication, and read him excerpts from the same book he'd written. One night, while they were watching the documentary together, Olivia looked at him and said, I think you found a way to transcend without forgetting who you were." James didn't respond immediately. He just nodded, his eyes shining. He understood that not all broken bonds could be repaired, but some could be transformed into something else, into respect, into care, into a second chance to be present without demands. During his convalescence, James spent time organizing all his notebooks. He categorized writings, selected fragments, and deleted what he considered unnecessary, not with the intention of publishing them, but to leave everything clear in case he was no longer there one day. He also wrote a letter, sealed, addressed to whoever would one day take his place as shelter coordinator. It didn't speak of rules or procedures, but of attitude. You are here to watch, listen, and support. Don't worry about making it perfect. Worry about making it present. He put the letter in the top drawer of his desk, just below the mirror, like someone leaving an unsigned map. When he recovered, he returned to his activities with renewed energy. The routine, far from tiring him, gave him peace. Each new face that arrived at the hospital represented another opportunity to serve, to learn, to continue sowing meaning. He had stopped seeking redemption long ago. Now he simply lived coherently. One afternoon, while cleaning one of the shelter's armchairs, he found a child's drawing taped under the seat. It was a house, a heart, and a man holding a mirror. Signed, "To the man who doesn't say much, but makes you feel better." James held it carefully between his fingers, as if it were a treasure. And in a way, it was. Is this touching your heart? Support us with your subscription. Only then can we continue sharing stories like this. As the years passed, his hair turned completely white and his gait slowed, but his presence remained constant. It was common to see James sitting in the shelter, reading, listening to soft music, or simply silently accompanying others. Some new volunteers didn't know exactly who he was. "Is that the writer?" they would ask. Or Mrs. Emily's widower. Others would respond with a smile, "It's James, just James." And that was enough, because he no longer needed surnames or labels. He was the man who had always been there, the one who knew when to speak and when simply to silently hold a hand. On one of her birthdays, the foundation organized a small celebration. Nothing fancy, just cake, letters, and heartfelt hugs. Olivia read aloud one of Emily's first diary entries. "I hope one day my name will serve for more than just remembering me. I hope it becomes an excuse to do good." Then, looking at James, she added, "And so it did." He said nothing. He just stood up, picked up the mirror that still accompanied him, and gently held it up. It was his way of saying thank you. Thank you to Emily, to those who had been with him, and to life for allowing him to transform from ruin. Over time, Emily's refuge was replicated in more than 20 hospitals across the country. Some had different names, different decorations, but all shared the same essence: a space for closure, dignity, and presence. James was invited to visit many of them, but only agreed to go to a few. He preferred to stay in the original, where it all began. Each time he entered, he paused in front of the plaque with Emily's name. Sometimes he whispered something. Sometimes he just touched the frame with his fingers. It was his way of keeping her close, not as a painful reminder, but as a constant guide. One day, without warning, James decided to write one last letter to Emily. Not to apologize, not to explain anything, just to tell her what he'd experienced since her departure. He told her about the shelter, the volunteers, the patients, the stories that intertwined without anyone forcing them. He told her he still used the mirror, that the stone was still on the desk, that Olivia had been with him longer than he deserved. He closed the letter with a phrase that came from his heart. "Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I already had." He folded the paper, placed it inside his notebook, and left it there, knowing that she somehow would read it. Over the years, his figure became a silent symbol of the hospital, not for what he said, but for what he represented. New patients asked about him. Staff from other areas approached him to ask him questions that weren't in any manual. James responded with gestures, with pauses, with his gaze. Sometimes he simply accompanied them. His wisdom didn't come from books, but from mistakes, from lost love, and from the journey from the depths to the light. His legacy was no longer just that of a man who had changed. It was that of someone who had learned to live for others without forgetting himself. One evening, while he was sorting books in the shelter's small library, a girl about 8 years old approached him. "Did you know Emily?" she asked curiously. James smiled, bent down to his eye level, and replied, "I still know her every day." The girl looked at him, not quite understanding, but she smiled back, and she gave him a drawing. It was the shelter, with many people inside, and in the center, a figure holding a mirror. James kept that drawing in the same place where he had the stone and the letter, because he understood that sometimes children speak the greatest truths without needing to fully understand them. If you've made it this far, it's because this story is worth it. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. When he turned 70, James decided it was time to prepare for his retirement. Not because he felt tired, but because he understood he needed to make room for new voices, new hands, new ways of caring. He calmly organized everything: documents, passwords, correspondence. He left clear instructions, but also room for his successor to forge his own path. One morning, he called together the team of volunteers and announced his decision. No one protested, no one cried. They just hugged him, one by one, like saying goodbye to someone who isn't truly gone. Because everyone knew that, although he would no longer be there every day, his mark would remain in every corner. At his last meeting as coordinator, James brought the mirror, the stone, the photo of the sunrise, and the black notebook. He placed them on the table and said, "This was my guidance, but each of you will find your own if you learn to look within." Then he gave each volunteer a copy of the first letter he received from Emily, the one that said she always knew everything and still believed. Because sometimes all we need to change is for someone not to give up on us, he added. It was his farewell, simple, sincere, unadorned, just as he had learned life should be when lived with purpose. After his retirement, James moved to a small house on the outskirts, surrounded by trees and silence. There he resumed a quiet routine, reading, writing, tending a modest garden. Sometimes he received visits from former colleagues from the foundation. Other times, he simply spent his days watching the seasons change. Emily's refuge was still going strong, now run by a young woman who had volunteered in his workshops. Occasionally, he received letters from patients or photographs of activities. James read them with a mixture of nostalgia and gratitude. He didn't feel like he was gone. He felt he had planted something that already had its own roots. One autumn afternoon, while sweeping dry leaves off the porch, James found a stone among the branches with a word carved into it: hope. He didn't know who had left it there, but he held it in his hands for a long time. He placed it next to the other stone, the one that said compassion, on the mantelpiece in his living room. Now he had two, and with them a message that summed up his entire journey. There is no true compassion without hope, and there is no real hope without an honest look at one's own reflection. In that moment, he understood that Emily had not only given him the tools to face the past, but also to sustain the future with dignity. As the days passed, James began writing a new notebook. It wasn't a diary or a memoir. It was a long letter addressed to anyone who might one day also feel broken, lost, with no way out. He spoke tenderly, without judgment. He told them that he had been there too, that he had also failed, lied, run away, but that he had discovered step by step that it's never too late to start over if you dare to look straight ahead. That letter had no specific recipient. It was for everyone and no one, for whoever needed it. And when he finished it, he kept it next to the mirror as if he knew that one day someone would find it. One weekend, returning from the market, James saw a young woman sitting in front of her house crying silently. He didn't know her, but something about her face struck a chord. He approached cautiously and offered her a glass of water. She accepted it, and after a few minutes began to talk. She had lost her mother, had been betrayed by her partner, and felt there was nothing left to rebuild. James didn't offer advice, he just listened. Finally, he handed her the notebook he had just written. "Read it when you're ready," he said. She hugged him without saying a word. It was then that James understood that her story had not been in vain, that even her pain, when shared, could be a relief to others. That night, James reopened the drawer where he kept his essential keepsakes: the mirror, the stones, the drawings, Emily's letter, the first notebook. He placed them one by one on the table, not to organize, but to contemplate. Each object represented a stage in his transformation. He no longer viewed them with guilt, but with respect, like someone who looks at scars not out of vanity, but to remember the cost of each step. He sat down in front of them with a cup of hot tea and wrote one last line in his new notebook: "If you ever doubt whether it's worth continuing, remember that even ruins can be foundations." Over time, the neighbors of the small town began to get to know him. They greeted him warmly, invited him to community gatherings, and consulted him when someone was going through difficult times. No one knew exactly what his past was, but everyone sensed that this man with the calm gaze and calm voice had been through something profound. James didn't talk much about his story unless someone asked him to, but whenever he did, he told it without drama, without glorification, like someone who has understood that life is made up of both mistakes and corrections, and that the true legacy is not what one leaves behind, but what one manages to awaken in others. One spring evening, while he was helping organize a local health fair, a teenage girl approached him to thank him. Her grandmother, a terminally ill patient, had spent her final days in one of the Emily-inspired shelters. "She told me she'd never felt so accompanied," the young woman recounted. James listened attentively, smiled, and replied, "That's thanks to many people, not just me." But inside, he sensed that Emily was still present, not as a ghost, but as a seed blossoming in every corner where loving care was offered. That night, he jotted in his notebook, "She never left. She just changed shape." On his daily walks, he would often stop in front of a nearby lake. He would sit on the same bench, silently, gazing at the reflection in the water. He liked to think that the mirror Emily left him was not only in his house, but also there, in nature, in the eyes of those who learned to look truthfully, in every gesture born of respect. Sometimes he would close his eyes and remember her voice, not to cling to the past, but to honor what transformed him. It no longer hurt. He had learned that memory, when cultivated with love, is not a burden, it is a lit lamp. In an interview with a local newspaper, James was asked what he considered his greatest achievement. He was silent for a few seconds before answering, "Not giving up when I discovered who I had become." The journalist jotted down the quote and asked if she could share it as a headline. He nodded, knowing that if just one person read it and decided to change, it would already be worth it. He didn't speak of redemption as something magical, but rather as a slow, sometimes painful, but always possible process. And if his story served as an example, so be it. Not for himself, but for those who still had time to choose another path. That same day, when he returned home, he found an envelope with no return address in his mailbox. Inside was a copy of his book with a handwritten note. "Thank you for your truth. You saved me." There was no signature. James held the book in his hands for several minutes, without moving. Then he placed it on his desk, next to the mirror and the stone. He didn't need to know who had sent it. The important thing was to know that it had arrived, that what he had once written from the depths of pain was now a light for someone else. And that was enough for him, because he understood that sometimes a story told honestly is enough to change another life. In his later years, James slowed down even further. He spent his mornings watering his plants, reading old letters, or answering messages from people who had encountered his story in books, talks, or articles. Sometimes he discreetly visited the original refuge. No one announced him, but his presence was instantly recognized. He would sit in the same chair, silently observe the place, and then quietly leave. He needed nothing more. Seeing that everything was still alive, that people were hugging each other, that the volunteers were gently accompanying them, was confirmation that his promise had been kept. One Sunday morning, while sweeping the porch, James felt a slight dizziness. He sat down and took a deep breath. It wasn't a shock, nor a tragic warning, just a reminder that time is finite. He smiled. He knew he had lived long enough to complete one cycle. That afternoon, he wrote one last note in his notebook. "If you're reading this, it's because I'm no longer here. But don't worry, I left in peace. Everything I needed to say is already in these pages. Everything I learned in those silences, and everything I was is in what I chose to do when I finally saw myself." He closed the notebook, left it on the desk, and lit a candle in front of the mirror. Days later, when James no longer responded to greetings from the neighborhood or appeared on his usual walks, Olivia went to visit him. She found the door ajar, the house in order, and a profound calm in the air. On the desk were the closed notebook, the burnt-out candle, the mirror, and the 2 stones. There was no sadness in the air, but a sense of serene farewell. James had departed as he had lived his final years, silently, purposefully, leaving gentle but indelible marks. Olivia didn't cry immediately. She sat in the chair in front of the desk, took the notebook, and hugged it to her chest, understanding that this was his true testament. The funeral was intimate. A few volunteers, former patients, neighbors, and of course Olivia. No one spoke of his past as a scandal. Everyone remembered the James who listened, who accompanied, who never promised more than he could deliver, but who was always there. At the end of the service, a child approached the coffin with a small mirror in his hand. "So you don't forget who you were," he said innocently. No one knew where that child had come from, but his gesture touched everyone. It was Olivia who took the mirror and gently placed it next to him, because she understood, like James, that there is no better farewell than to reflect what one chose to be in life. In the following months, James's story began to circulate more strongly, not as an official biography, but as a shared narrative among hallways, volunteers, patients, and families. At each shelter inspired by Emily, someone remembered her quotes, her notebook, her mirror. Some even replicated her ritual of placing stones with engraved words as a reminder of the values they sought to cultivate: compassion, hope, dignity, forgiveness. Thus, her legacy was not anchored to a building or a name, but became part of the everyday language of care. Over time, Olivia took on a more active role in the foundation, not out of obligation, but because she felt it was a way to continue the legacy of her sister and James. She kept all the notebooks, the letters, the notes. One day, in a talk to new volunteers, she said something that stuck with many. "Emily taught us not to give up on others. James taught us not to give up on ourselves." And in that simple yet powerful phrase, an entire philosophy of life was captured. A way of looking at human fragility with compassion, without ever losing sight of the possibility of transformation. Years later, a young volunteer found the notebook containing James's final letter and decided to digitize its entire contents. He shared it on palliative care forums, blogs, and social media. He titled it simply, "The Man in the Mirror." The story moved thousands. Some wrote to say they had started talking to their parents again, others that they had left toxic relationships. Several confessed that, for the first time, they had been encouraged to truly look at themselves, and so, what began as an intimate act of repentance grew into a wave of emotional awareness and shared hope. An illustrator created a mural at the entrance to the hospital where it all began. It depicted a male figure holding a mirror that reflected not a face, but a series of words: truth, love, reparation, courage. Every visitor who passed by saw a different word, depending on where they looked from. That work bore no signature, just a plaque at the bottom that read, "Thank you, James. Thank you, Emily." And that silent gratitude spoke louder than any statue, more than any speech. Because in the end, what they both left behind wasn't just a physical refuge, but a way of looking at the world. An invitation not to give up on others or on oneself, to believe that even from the deepest ruin, it's still possible to build something noble. James wasn't a hero. He was a man who dared to look at himself and decided to change. And that simple human gesture continues to multiply to this day. This channel exists thanks to people like you. If this story touched your heart, subscribe now. It's the best way to help us continue.